Bank robbers thought it was easy until they faced a tomb guard. It was a cold, crisp morning when the group of bank robbers gathered for their final planning session. In a small, dimly lit room on the outskirts of town, they sat around a table, the flickering light of a single bulb casting long shadows across their faces. The tension in the room was thick, but it wasn't because of fear. No, they were confident. This was going to be an easy job, perhaps one of the easiest they had ever pulled off. "All right," the leader of the group, a tall man with a gravelly voice named Greg, said as he placed a map of the bank on the table. "Everything we need is here. We know the security systems, the guard schedules, and the layout of the bank. It's just a matter of walking in, taking what we need, and getting out. Simple." The other members of the crew nodded in agreement. There was Tom, the getaway driver, who had a reputation for being fast and reliable. Then there was Dave, the quiet but efficient tech guy who had spent weeks studying the bank's alarm systems. And last but not least was Lisa, a skilled negotiator and the one who knew how to handle the civilians if things went awry. Together, they were an experienced team, and Greg was certain they could handle whatever the bank threw at them. The plan was simple. Greg and Lisa would enter the bank first, posing as customers. They would wait for the perfect moment when the bank was relatively empty, sometime after the morning rush but before the afternoon crowd. Once inside, they would activate a hidden signal that Dave had planted days earlier, disabling the bank's alarm system. That would give them an hour, plenty of time to get in, collect the money, and escape. Greg looked at the others, his gaze sharp and focused. No mistakes. "We all know what we're doing. This is a clean job, and we're going to make it as smooth as possible." Everyone nodded, their faces set in determination. They had pulled off smaller heists before, but this was going to be their biggest one yet. The money they'd be taking from the bank would set them up for life. No more petty jobs or running from the law. They would be free, able to live out their lives without looking over their shoulders. The plan had been carefully thought out, every detail meticulously accounted for. The team had practiced the steps countless times. They knew where the security cameras were located, how to avoid detection, and how to disable any alarms or sensors in their way. All the exits had been mapped out. Tom was ready in his car, parked at a safe distance from the bank, where he could quickly drive away as soon as they had the money. As the meeting came to an end, Greg gathered the group together one last time. "We do this quick, we do this clean, and we're out before anyone knows what hit them. Any questions?" There were none. The group was ready. The day of the heist arrived sooner than they had anticipated. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, the robbers made their final preparations. Lisa put on a long coat and styled her hair in a way that would help her blend in with the customers inside the bank. Dave, armed with his high-tech gadgets, double-checked the device that would disable the security system. Tom, meanwhile, sat in his car, running over the route he would take to make sure there were no surprises. Greg stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt and pulling on his gloves. He looked at himself for a moment, taking in the man he had become. A professional, a man who had spent years studying and planning for moments like this. Today was the day it would all come together. He had no doubts. As they drove toward the bank, the city streets were quieter than usual, the calm of the early morning setting the tone for what was to come. They parked in the designated spots, and Lisa, looking like any other businesswoman, made her way into the bank with a small briefcase in hand. Greg followed close behind, his eyes scanning the room for any potential issues. Inside, the bank was just as they had expected, empty, with only a few people milling about. The tellers were busy behind their counters, and the security guard stationed at the entrance barely glanced up as they entered. Greg and Lisa exchanged a brief nod, then moved to a corner of the bank to wait for the signal from Dave. Minutes passed like hours, and the anticipation began to build. Finally, Greg received the message on his phone. Dave had successfully disabled the alarm system. It was time. With a calmness that only a seasoned criminal could possess, Greg nodded to Lisa, who immediately stood and walked towards the front desk. Greg followed, his steps deliberate. They approached the nearest teller, a young woman who looked up at them with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and polite. "We're just here to make a withdrawal," Greg said smoothly, his voice steady. "Something big." Before the teller could respond, Greg quickly pulled out a small device and activated it, sending a signal to Dave to start disabling the cameras. It would only take a few moments before they would be in full control. Lisa, meanwhile, kept the teller distracted, asking about interest rates and account balances. The two worked in perfect sync, both calm and composed. Everything was going exactly as planned. But as they moved deeper into the bank, a strange sense of unease began to creep over Greg. He couldn't place it, nothing had changed, and everything was proceeding as expected. But there was something off about this place, something he couldn't quite shake. He brushed it aside. It was nothing. The job was easy. Then, as they approached the vault, something caught Greg's eye, a figure standing still, almost out of place. It was a security guard, but not just any guard. This man stood tall, his posture rigid and unyielding, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that sent a chill down Greg's spine. He was dressed in a military-style uniform, and though he didn't seem to be moving, Greg felt as though he was being watched. Greg couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort, as if this guard was more than just someone standing in the background. The man's presence was almost unnerving, but Greg quickly dismissed it. After all, there were plenty of guards in banks, and most of them were no threat at all. This one would be no different, or so Greg thought. The plan had been set in motion. The robbers were in position, and the time had come. Greg's pulse quickened as he glanced around the bank. Everything was in place. The security guard at the entrance was distracted, his eyes lazily scanning the room. The few customers scattered around the bank didn't seem to notice the two new arrivals. Everything felt calm, too calm. Lisa, standing near the front desk, kept her cool, talking with the teller as planned. The young woman behind the counter smiled politely, unaware of what was about to unfold. She asked Lisa about the details of her account, a routine transaction. Lisa was smooth, asking questions in a casual tone, playing the role of a customer. Greg stood nearby, watching her every move while subtly keeping an eye on the room. The other members of the crew were in position. Tom, the getaway driver, was parked a few blocks away, ready to jump into action at a moment's notice. Dave, the tech expert, had already disabled the security system, his job now completed. He had access to the alarm system and the cameras, ensuring no one would be able to track them. The disabling of the cameras meant that even if anyone noticed anything suspicious, there would be no footage of the robbery. They were effectively invisible. Greg was proud of how smoothly things were going. The bank had been quiet, almost eerily so. The plan was falling into place perfectly. But even as the moment of action neared, something nagged at the back of his mind. It wasn't fear, he had done this many times before, but there was an odd feeling in the air. A feeling he couldn't shake. Still, he brushed it off. It was probably just the adrenaline. He'd been in similar situations before. Focus on the job, Greg told himself. Focus on the money. The rest was just noise. After a few minutes, Lisa gave him a subtle nod. That was the signal. She had finished speaking with the teller, and now it was time to move. Greg took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and walked toward the vault. His steps were confident, controlled. There was no hesitation in him. This was the moment they had all been preparing for. As he walked, he glanced at the guard again. The man remained standing near the entrance, his expression unreadable. Greg felt an odd, growing sense of unease. Something about the way the guard stood still, his back straight, and his eyes fixed on the room, made Greg uneasy. This wasn't the usual lazy, disinterested guard who couldn't be bothered with a routine bank transaction. But Greg ignored the feeling. The plan hadn't changed. The vault was in sight now, just ahead. He could feel the weight of the money they would soon have in their hands. It was enough to change their lives forever. No more petty jobs, no more constant fear of being caught. This was it, this was the big one. Everything's fine, Greg muttered to himself. He smiled, reassuring himself that there was nothing to worry about. Just keep going. They reached the vault area. It was a small hallway that led to a large, reinforced steel door. Behind it were stacks of cash, gold bars, and other valuables. Greg knew that it would take only a few minutes to crack the vault open, but time was of the essence. Every second counted. He looked at Lisa, who was waiting by the door, ready to take action. She had a small device with her, the one they had planned to use to override the vault's security system. Greg nodded at her, signaling that it was time to get to work. Lisa quickly inserted the device into a small panel on the side of the door. A faint buzzing sound filled the air as the device did its job, overriding the security system and unlocking the vault. The sound of the lock disengaging was barely audible, but Greg's heart began to race. The vault was open. They were in. Lisa stepped back, giving Greg the space he needed to get to work. He pulled the door open and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. There were shelves stacked with cash, each one neatly organized and waiting to be taken. The sight made Greg's mouth water. This was what they had come for, but as he stepped inside, his eyes caught something unusual. It was the presence of the guard, who was still standing at the entrance of the bank, watching the room intently. His gaze never wavered, and his posture remained rigid. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, as if he was waiting for something to happen. Greg pushed the thought out of his mind. He had no time to waste on distractions. They were here for the money, and that's what he needed to focus on. He moved to one of the shelves and began stuffing bundles of cash into a large bag. His hands moved quickly, his mind sharp and focused. The money was so easy to grab, so easy to pack away. It was almost too easy. Everything had gone smoothly so far, and there was no reason to think it wouldn't continue. Lisa joined him, her own bag filling up with cash. The two of them worked in sync, their actions coordinated and smooth. They were almost done, Greg thought. Just a few more minutes and they could leave. The escape would be just as easy as the rest of the heist. Tom would be waiting for them, the getaway car ready to speed off into the night. But as he grabbed another stack of bills, something happened. A faint noise. Almost imperceptible, the softest click. It was like a whisper through the air, but it didn't belong. Greg paused, his hand still on the pile of money. His eyes flicked toward the entrance where the guard was still standing. There was no movement from him. He hadn't shifted his stance, hadn't taken a step. But that odd sensation grew stronger. It was as if the guard's presence filled the room, suffocating the air around him. Something wasn't right. Greg couldn't explain why, but a strange feeling gripped him. The guard's stillness, it wasn't normal. No ordinary security guard would stand like that. Not in this situation. Not when there was a robbery happening right in front of him. No, this guard wasn't ordinary. Greg took a deep breath, trying to push the unsettling feeling away. Focus, he told himself. You've been in situations like this before. This was just nerves, but the nagging sense of something being off wouldn't leave him. The longer he stood there, the more he felt it, a subtle but powerful shift in the air. The room felt smaller, suffocating, and then just as Greg moved to grab another bundle of cash, it happened. The guard took a slow, deliberate step toward the vault. His boots clicked against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the silence. It wasn't a rushed move. There was no urgency in his step. But there was something else in his movement, a quiet, controlled precision that immediately set off alarms in Greg's mind. The heist was no longer as easy as it had seemed. Something was wrong. The air was thicker now, the tension palpable. The guard's eyes never left the robbers. It was like he could see through them, see every move they made before they made it. Greg froze, feeling a sense of dread creeping over him. It was too late to turn back now, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary bank guard. The robbery had taken a turn, and they were about to find out just how much they had underestimated their opposition. Greg's heart began to race. The guard's slow, deliberate steps toward the vault were unlike anything Greg had ever encountered. He had been in many heists, and he had dealt with more security guards than he could count. Some had been lazy, others had been distracted, but none had ever made him feel like this. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air around him grew heavy as he turned to look at Lisa. She was still stuffing cash into her bag, unaware of the shift that had occurred. She was focused on the task, her movements precise and quick, but Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The guard continued to move toward them, his posture rigid and controlled, like a soldier on patrol. He wasn't rushing, but every step he took seemed calculated, measured. It was as if he knew exactly what he was doing. The unease in Greg's chest tightened. "Lisa," Greg whispered, his voice barely audible, "something's off. This guy, he's not normal." Lisa paused for a moment, her hands still gripping the cash, but she didn't look up. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice calm but puzzled. Greg's eyes locked on the guard. "Just watch him. He's not reacting like any guard I've ever seen." The guard's eyes flickered briefly in Greg's direction, but he didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he continued to move closer, each step slow but steady, as if he had all the time in the world. Greg's instincts screamed at him to move, to act, but his body didn't respond. His feet were frozen to the floor. The guard's presence was like an invisible weight pressing down on him. Lisa finally looked up and followed Greg's gaze. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't speak immediately. It was clear that she, too, felt the tension in the air. She turned her attention back to the task at hand, but Greg could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "We've got to move, Greg," Lisa said quietly. "We've got the money, let's go." But Greg couldn't bring himself to follow her instructions. Something about the guard felt different. The room had grown unnervingly quiet, and it was as if the world around them had gone still. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him. The guard was now just a few feet away. Greg could see every detail of the man's uniform, neat, perfectly pressed, and unmistakably military in appearance. It was unlike the usual security uniforms he had seen. There was no name tag, no badge, just the symbol of a tomb guard embroidered on the sleeve. Greg's mind raced, but he couldn't place it. What did this man represent? Greg's eyes darted toward the entrance of the bank, searching for an exit. He had to think. He had to act. But every time he thought about moving, his mind was clouded by the presence of the guard. It was as if he was being drawn into the man's calm, unwavering gaze. The silence between them grew unbearable. The guard took another step closer, his footsteps now echoing in the otherwise quiet room. And then, as if sensing Greg's tension, he spoke. "Stop," the guard said, his voice deep and commanding. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority. Greg's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected the guard to speak. He hadn't expected him to do anything, really. But now that he had, Greg felt the weight of his words and the chill that spread through the room. "Leave the money," the guard continued, his tone calm yet firm. "It's over." Greg's mind raced. Leave the money? This was insane. They couldn't just leave. They had come all this way. The money was right in front of them. This was the job. This was the plan. Everything had been calculated, every detail accounted for. They couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything. Lisa looked at Greg, her expression filled with confusion and concern. She didn't understand what was happening. Greg didn't understand what was happening. The guard's words, however, sent a clear message. They were dealing with someone far beyond the ordinary. "Who the hell are you?" Greg demanded, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound confident. He had to keep control. He had to stay calm. The guard didn't flinch. His eyes never wavered. "I am the last thing you'll see before it all ends," he said quietly, his words slow and deliberate. Greg swallowed hard. The guard's words weren't just threats. They were cold, certain, as if this was all a foregone conclusion. The air around them grew thicker, and Greg could feel his hands beginning to shake. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to grab Lisa and make a run for it. But he couldn't. Something held him in place. The guard took another step forward. This time, Greg didn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor as if by some invisible force. The room felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with its tension. And then, in one swift motion, the guard reached into his coat, pulled out a small device, and pressed a button. A loud beeping sound filled the room, echoing off the walls. It wasn't the sound of a typical alarm, but it was enough to make Greg's heart skip a beat. The bank's security systems weren't down anymore. The cameras, the alarms, they were all back online. In an instant, the robbery was no longer hidden from the outside world. The sound of the beeping continued, a relentless reminder that everything had changed. Greg's mind raced as he realized what had just happened. The guard had triggered the alarm. The heist was over. "Get down," Greg shouted at Lisa, his voice frantic. He pushed her away from the vault, but she didn't move as quickly as he had hoped. Her eyes were wide, still struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. But it was too late. The door to the bank burst open, and two more security guards rushed inside, their guns drawn. The sight of them only added to the confusion, but it was clear that the guard at the entrance wasn't just any security guard. He was something else entirely. Lisa and Greg were surrounded. Greg's mind whirled with panic. They had failed. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This wasn't part of the plan. How had everything gone so wrong? The tomb guard, still standing in the same spot, turned slowly toward the newly arrived security personnel. His expression remained calm, composed, and unshaken. It was like he had been prepared for this moment all along. Greg realized then that they had never had a chance. The tomb guard had been prepared for them from the start. His presence in the bank wasn't a coincidence. He had known what they were going to do. He had been waiting for them. And now there was nothing they could do to escape. The situation had spiraled out of control faster than Greg could have ever imagined. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen. caught between the two security guards who had just entered the bank and the tomb guard who was still standing in the same spot, unmoving. The quiet that filled the room was suffocating, broken only by the relentless beeping of the security alarm that now echoed through the bank. Lisa, who had been standing beside the vault, now took a step back, her face pale. She seemed to be grasping the gravity of what had just happened. The robbery had been planned with precision, each step thought out to perfection, but now it all seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. "Greg, what's going on?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. She turned her gaze between Greg and the tomb guard, who still hadn't moved an inch. Her confusion was palpable. Greg's mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. The guard had triggered the alarm. The plan had been flawless until this man, this tomb guard, had intervened. There was no way they could get out now. They were trapped. The beeping alarm, the presence of the security guards, the tomb guard's unwavering composure, it all signaled the end of the heist. But Greg wasn't ready to give up yet, not without a fight. His body tingled with adrenaline, and his hand instinctively moved toward the gun tucked in his waistband. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. This man, this guard, wasn't like the others. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he carried himself that made Greg hesitate. The two security guards who had just entered the bank stood behind Greg and Lisa, blocking any chance of escape. Their eyes were cold, trained on the robbers. They hadn't drawn their weapons yet, but Greg knew that the next move would be theirs to make. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The silence was unbearable, and it felt as though the world outside had vanished. All that mattered now was the tomb guard, the one who had disrupted everything. Lisa took a cautious step forward, her voice low but steady. "Who are you?" she asked, her eyes locked on the tomb guard. The guard didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to convey his authority. There was a sense of power in the way he stood, unmoving, his eyes unwavering. He was not just a guard, he was something more. "I've seen enough," the tomb guard finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You won't get away with this." Greg's heart skipped a beat. The guard wasn't threatening them in the way they had expected. There was no aggression in his voice, no panic, just calm certainty, but for Greg it only added to his unease. This man wasn't afraid, he wasn't rattled. He had been ready for this moment all along. "Get down on the ground," one of the security guards shouted, his voice breaking the silence. He had pulled his gun and was pointing it directly at Greg. Lisa flinched, her hands instinctively raising in defense, but Greg stood his ground. He couldn't give in, not yet. "No," Greg said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not going down without a fight." But the tomb guard didn't move. He simply watched, his eyes calculating, his posture unyielding. His gaze shifted slightly toward the two security guards behind Greg and Lisa. For a moment, it seemed as if he was making some sort of silent assessment. Then, as though he had reached a decision, the tomb guard stepped forward. With a speed that was almost impossible to follow, the tomb guard moved toward the two security guards. It was a blur, a sudden shift of movement, and then the two men were on the ground, disarmed and struggling to get up. Greg blinked in disbelief. The tomb guard hadn't used a gun. He hadn't even drawn a weapon. His movements had been fast, precise, and almost graceful. Before Greg knew what was happening, the two armed security guards were lying on the floor, their guns scattered across the ground. Lisa gasped. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Greg couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. The tomb guard wasn't just some ordinary man. He was a force, calm, controlled, and utterly in charge of the situation. He had taken out two trained security guards without breaking a sweat, without a single shot fired. The power this man held was undeniable. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Greg's mind was spinning. The robbery was over. There was no way they could escape now. Even if they somehow managed to overpower the tomb guard, the alarm was blaring and the authorities would be on their way. The only thing left was surrender, but Greg wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. The tomb guard turned to face Greg and Lisa once more. His gaze was unflinching, unyielding. "It's over," he said simply. "You've made your choice, now face the consequences." Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry. The reality of the situation hit him with full force. The robbery had failed, not because of the security system, not because of the guards, but because of this man, this tomb guard who had been waiting for them, waiting to stop them. Lisa took a step back, her hands raised in surrender. She seemed to have come to the same realization as Greg. They had lost. There was no escape. The tomb guard had sealed their fate. There was nothing left to do but face what was coming next. Greg's eyes darted toward the exit, but it was no use. He knew he had nowhere to run. The sound of sirens outside only added to his sense of hopelessness. They were trapped in the bank with no way out, surrounded by the aftermath of their failure. The tomb guard, still as calm and composed as ever, walked slowly toward them, his steps deliberate. There was no malice in his expression, no anger. He was simply doing his duty as if this was just another day for him. A job completed, a mission accomplished. Greg stood still, his mind racing. He was defeated, but part of him still couldn't accept it. Part of him still wanted to fight, to try and escape, but he knew it was futile. The tomb guard had won, and with that, the heist was over. As the sirens grew louder, the tomb guard turned his back to Greg and Lisa and moved toward the entrance. He didn't need to say another word. His presence had already spoken volumes. For the first time in a long while, Greg felt the weight of his decisions and the consequences of underestimating the unexpected. The sirens outside grew louder and more insistent, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. Greg stood motionless, his body frozen with the weight of what had just happened. The tomb guard's presence had shifted everything. What had begun as a perfect heist, carefully planned and executed, had ended in disaster. Now, as the reality of the situation settled in, Greg felt the cold grip of defeat. Lisa stood beside him, her hands still raised slightly in surrender. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of confusion and resignation. She had been a part of many heists, but this one was different. It wasn't just the robbery that had gone wrong, it was the man who had stopped them. The tomb guard. He wasn't like any opponent they had ever faced. Greg couldn't tear his eyes away from the tomb guard. The man had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, never once showing signs of panic or aggression. He was methodical, precise, and most of all, unyielding. It wasn't just his strength that had stopped them. It was his presence. His ability to control the situation, to anticipate every move they made, that had sealed their fate. "Are we going to jail?" Lisa asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence between them. She had been with Greg for a long time, but she had never been in a situation like this before. They had always been able to slip away to make a clean getaway. But now they were cornered, trapped, and the walls were closing in. Greg didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened in such a short time. They had been so sure of themselves. The money had been within their grasp. And then, just like that, it was all gone. The tomb guard had made sure of that. The beeping alarm continued to echo through the bank, a constant reminder of their failure. The sound seemed to get louder, more intrusive, as the seconds passed. Every passing moment felt like an eternity. It was only a matter of time before the police arrived and put an end to everything. Greg knew they had no chance of escaping now. They were surrounded by the tomb guard and the two other security guards, who were still recovering from the tomb guard's swift and brutal takedown. There was no way out. They had lost. The tomb guard, his expression as unreadable as ever, took one last look at Greg and Lisa before turning toward the entrance. His job was done. His task had been completed. He had protected the bank, stopped the robbery, and ensured that justice would be served. Greg and Lisa were left standing in the middle of the bank, surrounded by the aftermath of their failed heist. There was no escape. There was no victory, only defeat. As the door to the bank opened, the flashing lights of the police cars outside lit up the room. Several officers entered, their guns drawn and their faces serious. They immediately took control of the situation, securing the bank and making sure that everyone was accounted for. It wasn't long before Greg and Lisa were handcuffed and led out of the building. The tomb guard, standing quietly near the entrance, watched as the officers took Greg and Lisa into custody. He didn't say a word. There was no need. He had done his job, and now it was over. The officers didn't seem to acknowledge the tomb guard's presence, their focus solely on the criminals who had tried to rob the bank. But the tomb guard didn't care. He wasn't looking for recognition or praise. His duty had been fulfilled, and that was all that mattered. Greg and Lisa were placed into the back of a police car, their hands bound and their heads hanging low in defeat. They could hear the faint sound of the sirens growing quieter as the car pulled away, but it didn't matter. The job was over. They had failed. As they were driven away, Greg couldn't help but think back to the moment when the tomb guard had stepped into the scene. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that the robbery would go smoothly. But now, with the weight of the consequences pressing down on him, he realized just how wrong he had been. They hadn't been dealing with an ordinary guard. They had underestimated the tomb guard, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. Lisa glanced over at Greg, her eyes filled with frustration and anger. But there was something else there too, a recognition of the truth. They had been outmatched. They had been defeated by something they hadn't even seen coming. It wasn't just a guard they had faced. It was a force beyond their understanding, and they had failed to reckon with it. "Do you think he knew?" Lisa asked quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Greg sighed, his shoulders heavy with the burden of their defeat. "I don't know," he said softly. "But whatever it was enough to stop us." The police car continued to drive through the streets, the city's lights flashing by as they made their way to the station. Greg and Lisa sat in silence, the reality of their situation settling in. There would be no more heists. No more easy jobs. They had tried to outsmart fate, but fate had a way of dealing with them in ways they couldn't understand. As the car pulled into the station, the doors were opened, and Greg and Lisa were let out, their heads still low in defeat. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the cold, empty night as they were escorted into the building. They had been caught, and there was no going back now. The tomb guard's job was done. The robbery had been stopped, and justice had been served. But for Greg and Lisa, the consequences of their actions were just beginning.